Tervetuloa Eurooppa-foorumin 3. päivään. Minä olen Josefina Tuomala ja toimin tänään täällä pienellä näyttämöllä juontajana. Tuttuun tapaan kaikki ohjelmat livestriimataan ja suomenkielinen ohjelmasisältö tulkataan englanniksi. Seuraavan ohjelman kieli on englanti, joten jatkan juonnon loppuun englanniksi. Welcome everyone to the third day of Europe-forum in Turku. My name is Josefina Tuomala and I'm your stage host today. As usual, this program is live streamed online. If you want to participate in the chat discussion, you may read the QR code on the screen, which takes you straight into the right place. Next up, we will hear a discussion titled Threats and Opportunities to Democracies in the New Global Landscape, Assessing Our Values Standing Towards 2030s. This discussion is brought to you by the European Parliament Information Office in Finland and European Commission Representation in Finland. Welcome everyone.
Good afternoon to everyone and welcome to this panel discussion. Let me start by saying that it is extremely nice to be in Turku. I would claim that Europe-forum is the key event in Finland, annual event, where we focus on all sorts of issues that are relevant for the European Union. Now, looking back some 10 years ago, I think quite a few of us would have had a fairly positive view about the world. But sadly, since then, things have not really gone as we hoped them to go. And the environment in which we navigate at the moment is certainly more uncertain and also very challenging. And that is why we will be digging into a very important question today, which is how the liberal values will and can stand out in a global landscape where the battle of values is already very fierce. And I think it's a timely issue for us to assess today as we are on the verge of both the EU and the US setting up new administrations. But before we move on, I would like to introduce our distinguished panelists, Mr. Douglas Hickey, the US Ambassador to Finland, Li Andersson, member of the Left Group in the European Parliament, party leader and former minister of the Left Alliance. We have Mika Aaltola, also a member of the European Parliament in the group of the European People's Party and former director of the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. And lastly, but not least, my colleague Taneli Lahti from the Commission. He is the head of the cabinet for Commissioner Jutta Urpilainen. My name is Maria Blessar and I will be moderating this debate. I would also like to welcome the audience, both here in Turku and also online. If time allows, I will try to see if we can also take final questions from the chat. So, when looking at the environment which we live in now, it is quite clear that Russia's full-scale invasion to Ukraine was some kind of a turning point when we look at global power dynamics. It affects, of course, the post-World War II institutional setup. We can see, for instance, that the United Nations and the World Trade Organization are being challenged from inside much more profoundly than before. Of course, at the same time, we also see that our Nordic EU member states have now forged a stronger NATO. You could even claim that a more European NATO in that way. But the question is, to what extent the war and also the global race for technological supremacy pose a permanent threat to or challenge for democracy? And I would like to start by quoting Anne Applebaum. She's a very renowned, distinguished American journalist and historian who focuses, among other things, on international relations. And she writes in her recent book called Autocracy, Inc., and I quote, "The liberal world order no longer exists, and the desire to create one no longer seems realistic," end of quote. Now, could I ask all panelists to raise their hand if you agree with what Anne Applebaum is claiming? Ooh.
Depends.
No hands up.
Well,
Like this.
All right, 1.5 then. Okay, that's interesting.
I'm not going to change my opinion.
Well, could I ask, perhaps we start with you, Lee, why you only agree or disagree in half terms?
Yeah, I think this is...
1 minute answer.
Okay, let's see. I think, of course, I mean, if we look at a global level at the moment, what is happening in different states, what is happening in democracies, I mean, we have all seen this trend towards democracies being more and more challenged. Fewer and fewer of people globally are living in democracies, and you can also see this trend where democracies are being challenged from within. We all know these trends and developments. But at the same time, I think it's important also to note that if you look at the level of ordinary people, in my opinion, we should not overlook the fact that traditional values, freedom of expression, freedom to participate politically, they are still, in my opinion, as strong as before, and we should not overlook the fact that we have so many very courageous people in Afghanistan, for example, fighting for fundamental rights also for women, or in Belarus, fighting for political freedom. So maybe more focusing on how we can support the forces, the people that are fighting for these traditional values, than thinking that we have to give up on them altogether, or that it's not realistic anymore to think that we can, build a democracy and build politics based on these fundamental values.
Thank you. Mika, you could maybe give your short answer.
Well, I'm keen follower of Anne Applebaum, and I have to say that usually what she says makes sense. So I believe that, I haven't read the book, but it is a fragment from a more broad work charting the histories and understanding what is going on. The world order, of course, is being contested. In that sense, the liberal world order is no longer the sole world order. And she's right that the motive, the political will to fight for it perhaps no longer exists. So the Western heartland, well, let's go back first. Liberal world order was previously called the Western world order, and now it is called the rule-based world order. It has been transforming itself, it has become more global, but of course it has faced the obstacle, the war you mentioned, a key factor. Clearly, Russia is contesting the rule-based world order or the liberal world order. The failure of the so-called rise of China theory, that China will peacefully rise and integrate into the liberal world order, that was a key moment of realization that actually we should do something, but everybody's saying that China is too big of a problem for us to deal with, so we cannot phantom or gather the political will of re-energizing the democratic liberal world order that has a Western base. So what to do? It's a moment of, I think, anxiety. We are fearful of the key aspect, key institution of the liberal world order, elections. US elections are approaching, and people are seeing quite a lot of bad things that might result from that. The European Parliament elections, a lot of people were seeing that something really scary might happen. So we have lost our energy.
We can go back to that later on, but Ambassador Hickey, would you mind
This is why this is why these discussions are so important. I couldn't disagree more. And I'm a huge supporter of Anne's work in general. I just look at the world a little differently now. I think we're in many ways more united than we have been in a long, long time. So if you look at NATO as an example, NATO is stronger than it has been almost from the inception of NATO. If you look at the addition of Finland and Sweden into NATO, it's made NATO stronger, it's made Sweden and Finland stronger, but it's made the world safer. And the other thing I think we need to think about, I was thinking about this last night, is I don't see a lot of migration to countries like Iran and Russia and China. I mean, pick in Belarus. So pick whatever countries you want to look at. So I think democracy wins, quite frankly. And if you're a supporter of any human rights or the support of the press, there isn't a better place to be than in a democracy. That doesn't mean it's easy. It's really hard. And I think this is a wake-up call, quite frankly, for democracy, what's happening. And the general populace, in many cases, I think, is waking up to the fact that we're going to have to make a binary decision that's going to be led by government and civil society of, do you want to be part of democracy or do you want to be part of an autocracy? And I think when you frame it in that context, there aren't too many people that are going to be running to say they want autocracy, they want democracy. Now, they might want changes, and they might want a bigger voice in democracy, and that's all legitimate, because it's not perfect, but it is the best we have.
Thank you very much. Taneli.
Yeah, I'm a modest civil servant, but and I tend to be realist and sometimes even cynical. But here, I mean, I have still some, feelings left. in my. I really genuinely believe, and just like Ambassador Hickey and the Honourable Member Li Andersson, that it is really, I mean, if people have a choice, I mean, they will want to go for values and principles that the so-called liberal world order represents: freedom of choice, freedom of participation, freedom of opinion. All of that, I don't think that anyone anywhere in the world would voluntarily be against any of that. And in my current job, I mean, we with Commissioner Urpilainen, and we interact very much and with people, young people from all around the world. And I haven't heard any of them say that I would like to live in an autocracy. I mean, they rather aspire for the things and for the values and for the principles and the freedoms that we all here in Europe have.
Let's move on. I'll give you the floor in a minute. Perhaps it's a question of actually people wanting something and the state's capability of promoting whatever it is that they want to promote. Okay, I'll also quote something that Finland's President Alexander Stubb very recently wrote in The Economist. He said that the era of Western domination, as we used to know it, is over. The global West wants to preserve the current world order because they built the institutions and rules that support it. But in many ways, those institutions fail to reflect the geopolitical realities of today. So we see that the autocracies are collaborating much more. We see Russia's aggressiveness. It doesn't appear to be diminishing anytime soon. We also debate whether the US will be the last guarantor of Europe's security, while the EU, as we heard in the panel, the previous panel, is trying to build up a better military capacity. So these are the drivers that we are talking about. But against this background, my first specific question goes to Ambassador Hickey. So how do you see global developments affecting the value standing of the West in the world? How could the US and the EU make sure that they can actually cooperate in the middle of the current geopolitical realities?
Yeah. I think it's important to realize if you look at GDP as one of the metrics to look at things, 76% of the world's GDP sits in democracies. I mean, it's pretty phenomenal. So we have a great trading environment amongst friends and people that think alike and that are willing to protect IP rights, as an example. So I think that's a really important element. The relationship between the U.S. and Europe, I have to say, sometimes crises it strengthen relationships, and I think what Putin did in Ukraine clearly awakened people. So I think it strengthened that relationship, and it will continue to strengthen. You've heard Secretary Blinken say it over and over again that one of the first calls we make for support and discussion is to the EU. So I think we're going to see that continue. Now, there's got to be fundamental changes too, and I think President Niinistö has said this for a long time, is Europe needs to stand up and build up its defenses. And while the US can be a supporter, it can't be the only one at the table. And so we all need to build up our strength in the right way, because Russia will not go away. I hear from my Finnish friends all the time, which is, I think, is probably right, that regardless of the outcome in Ukraine, Russia will reconstitute itself, and you can debate whether it's 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years. So we, as a community of the EU, of NATO, of partners in the Indo-Pacific and the Global South, need to be aware of that and need to think about that. And then I would just pose one question as we're thinking about this whole thing. I was just thinking about it when you were talking about President Stubb. I'm sure if I asked this audience if Putin was running for president or Alex Stubb was running for president, who would you vote for? And I think, I assume it's a pretty high number, right, that would vote for Alex. But that's what we're dealing with. Those are the kind of stark choices that we have. And we need to be prepared, not just from a military perspective, from a technology side, from a climate piece of it. We need to be prepared for all those things. And we're better off working together than not. We have much more in common than we disagree on, quite frankly.
We have this very deep cooperation, that's true, but how does the US perceive, nevertheless, the EU's pursuit for more strategic autonomy, be it defense, raw materials, technology? Is that an easy
Come on down. I think it's important because we can't be the only one, right? We welcome the idea that the EU strengthens its position from a military perspective, that continues to garner great technology and IP rights. We support that. On rare minerals, clearly we support that. It's important to all of us that we're trading with partners we can trust, and clearly the EU we can trust, and the members of the EU. So I think we're very forward-leaning on support there. And regardless, you mentioned the elections coming up in November in the United States. Regardless of the outcome of the elections, I think there's common thinking on many of those issues. There might be some issues that people disagree on, but I think when you look at foreign policy as an example, like the NATO accession, it was a 95-1 vote in the US Senate.
All right.
It's critical.
Thank you very much. Let's move to Li Andersson and Mika Aaltola. You have been recently elected as members of the European Parliament. So I have a common question to you both. How should the EU respond, maybe together with the US, to the changing global order in order to be better able to uphold our democracy worldwide? And perhaps to continue a little bit, is multilateralism still alive and kicking? Or should we need to establish something new around that? Would you like to start?
Yeah, well, I mean, firstly, if we look at the role of the EU and also the US in the global order, I think there's a little bit of a tendency also in this debate that we talk about autocracies and then we talk about the West, forgetting all of the rest of the world. If you think about the global South, for example, I think one very big question for the EU and for Europe is what role do we want to have globally? Like what role do we envisage for EU in the upcoming years in terms of building companionships with different countries? What role do we want to see in terms of vocational education, investment, the whole green transition, also on the other side of our own borders? And in this regard, personally, I think multilateralism is alive and kicking still, but we also need to think about how we can strengthen multilateralism, how we can strengthen those kind of institutions. I think one issue, unfortunately, that will affect relations between Europe and the West and other countries has to do with Gaza, for example, where you have seen South Africa and different countries actually using the institutions, multilateral institutions, for addressing these issues. How do the West want to respond to that? Are we supporting them? Do we react to statements by the International Court of Justice and so on? I think like making sure that we are consequent when we talk about international law, multilateralism and human rights, that's also fundamental for us to be able to build kind of credible relationships to other countries around the globe, which we will need as our partners if we want to fight the real autocracies.
Thank you. Mika, your turn.
Well, I was going to remark on the previous round we had, democracy has appeal, and the values, the freedoms associated with has appeal. Pew Research Center came out with a massive opinion poll a few weeks ago. Basically, 78% of people around the world believe and they want to live in democracies.
Yeah.
The alternatives are not regarded very high. Military rule, for example, is very lowly regarded. So it's clear that the Western liberal rule-based ideals are still relatively universal. But the steam of supporting those so that we could actually, in different places, clearly show that we are standing for people's democratic rights, that has been lost.
So what should we do then?
Well, we should gather some steam. We are going to lose this geopolitical challenge that is just emerging. It's rising up. We are going to see quite a lot of different events, episodes associated with over the next decades or so. So we should fix our own politics so that from different places of the world they could look up to us, that we are actually carrying out the democratic values that we so dearly believe in. And marketing of those, after the Cold War ended, we became very passive when it came to active operations, spreading the values that are so instinctively loved by people. We believed in this soft power, that somehow these things are going to go according to our plans, even in absence of us not pushing them. We should push them. I'm not saying that we should militarily go and change regimes and try to foster democracy. They have power, and we should be much cleverer in using the natural appeal of democratic values. We are now allowing Russia to spoil. We are allowing China to have its own model to replace them. And somehow we are still very passive.
Thanks. Lee, just
Yeah, I think actually Taneli can talk about this, but I think like the EU's global agenda should be focusing on civil society, for example. Those are the grassroots actors that push for democracy, push for fundamental rights, young people, and education. And throughout the European election, we did not talk about what role we envisage for the EU globally. I think it's very much focused at the moment on internal issues, security, and so on. So I think Taneli should continue to talk about.
absolutely. This is a good passage to that. So Taneli, I just wanted to bring up the fact that you have been precisely working with the international partnerships that your commission has been building, and you have been promoting Global Gateway. Now, how do you see that the EU can actually compete with China? You can come back to the other questions, but are the African, Asian and South African countries, are they more likely to collaborate with non-democratic countries in the pursuit of better life or whatever?
Thank you, and thank you very much, Leah, for the very kind passing over of the baton. No, one comment first. I think we have to be a little bit careful ourselves and not to talk about Western values and the global South, because by that we also in a way tell ourselves, or we amplify the polarization that is out there, and that is something that, for example, autocratic actors like Russia want to do. I mean, they are basically telling our partners wherever they are in Africa, Latin America, or Asia, that look, it is the West that is representing Western values, not yours. It is the West, the former colonial powers, and that they are the bad guys. And we should not fall into this trap, and we should not get into that debate. I think if there is this competition with China and for offers, I think in the end it's obvious that we will win. Because our offer is based on values and principles that are appreciated by people all around the world. They may not be immediately appreciated by the autocratic leader who you're trying to negotiate with, but the young people, civil society, anywhere in the world, if they have a choice, it is rather for working with democracies that represent these values that everybody, or the 80% at least of the world population, will want to have. I think, and where we are, and European Union, I mean, we still globally matter. I like to believe that European Union is still amongst the 3-4 world powers or sort of global actors, and that can actually make a difference with the US, China, and possibly India. Russia, I'm afraid to say, has rather the capacity to spoil than to create much anything, despite all its capacity and potential that it would have. But the share of Europe of the world GDP 40 years ago was about 40%, 40. Now it's somewhere between 15 and 20, and it will decrease in the next 10 years. We will be close to about 10% of the world GDP. It still matters if we act as Europe, obviously, and if we engage with our partners. If we stop looking inwards, and Europe has been, as Lee was correctly saying, for the past 15 years, and we've been obsessed with our domestic problems. We've a little bit forgotten about the rest of the world, and I think that's where we should pay attention. Global Gateway is our way of trying to listen to our partners, hear what it is that they would want to do with us, try to promote investment into sustainable green digital transition, education, healthcare, and so forth, together with the private sector in our partner countries and from Europe. It is actually working, and and the strategy is there since 2.5 years. We put very high ambition levels as objectives, but it is actually delivering. I'm sometimes a bit surprised myself that it's working so well, but it is actually working, and we are working very well with the US as well on this.
Isn't a concrete example of the Global Gateway that there was a vaccine production facility created in Senegal?
Yes.
I mean, when the pandemic hit, there was absolutely no vaccine production in Africa whatsoever. So this is one example, a concrete example of what it has brought about.
That's correct, yes. I mean, there was hardly any vaccine production of any kind in Africa until a few years ago. And then with the COVID pandemic, we started looking into reasons why is that the case. One reason was that the regulatory framework for producing and distributing vaccines on the African continent was not really there. The private sector or the investors were ready to go there, but the conditions for the investment were not so much there. It was not even so much a question of money, but the conditions for the investment. We tried to solve those issues together with our African partners and with the private sector and with the European Investment Bank, and now there is actually capacity for vaccine production in several spots in Africa. That capacity is not at the moment primarily needed for COVID vaccines, but for other types of vaccines, and I think it's something that makes Africa a little bit stronger.
And I think it's fair to say that the next pandemic will come one day or another, and some other health risks. Okay, so let's move on. In the current geopolitical environment, the West wants to build up its own defense. Perhaps I shouldn't use this word West, but okay. But how does this fit in with our desire to make human rights, democracy, and rule of law a reality for more people in the world? And perhaps the key question here is whether there is a trade-off between our values and interests, such as security and trade. So let's start this time with Mika, please.
Well, there's no necessary conflict. There might be some paradoxes and some, of course, uncomfortable feelings because the challenge by Russia, it's a military one, and it has to be answered. And one fundamental right that people have is to live their lives in absence of foreign enemies. It is a clear, ancient right that people have and they desire for. So that right, I think, is becoming a fundamental right in the European North and also in Eastern European countries. We feel the Russian pressures in here, and we have the right to live in absence of laws. So clearly, we need to reorganize our fundamental rights in a proper way fitting to this scenario that we are actually living in. So what is fundamental for the rights of people? Unfortunately, the world is not a pleasant place, and it's going to become even more cumbersome in the near future because the challenge is there. Autocratic, totalitarian regimes, they have quite a lot of power and they are strategically thinking about these things. So if we are absent-minded and drifting, nothing good will result from that. Even in the global gateway, we have to be clear that it is a strategical tool. For example, allowing Chinese to participate in the bidding in Africa actually helps the Chinese to bring in their influence there. So kind of the disembodied nature of the global gateway perhaps is not allowing us to use it for the proper directions.
Okay. What would you say to that?
I would agree. I actually think there's opportunity here. The issue around China in how we talk about competition, everybody wants China at the table to compete. They just want them at the table playing by the same rules. So, I'll give you a prime example on secure wireless as an example. We look at it and say there's really only two companies that can provide secure wireless, and that's Nokia and Ericsson. Mm-hmm. So the US does not have a horse in that race, if you will. The Chinese have Huawei and ZTE and others. And what we've seen in many of these cases is that our friends at Nokia will go in and bid something at $100 or 100 euros, and our friends from Huawei will come in at 70. And then when they get pushed on it, when Nokia wins the award, Huawei comes in at 30 euros. Well, no commercial enterprise can compete at that level. So what's happening is effective dumping. And so my view is if we want to compete with technologies, let's compete head to head. I'll compete with US technology against Finnish technology, and the Finns will compete against the US. That's all fair game. What's not fair game is when you're dumping product, and the other is when you're stealing IP. One of the amazing things about Finland is the amount of just world-class technology that exists. If you take that and steal it and use it for your own production value, that's just not fair. Mm-hmm. That doesn't happen outside of democracies because the IP rules in democracies look pretty similar. How we look at IP regulations in Finland and the EU and the US look really similar. There might be a couple nuance points, but they look very similar. In China, they look nothing like it. So I agree. I mean, we shouldn't be afraid to compete. I mean, we want to compete, but we ought to compete in a fair and logical way that everybody has a fair shot at winning, and you win because you have the best price performance.
Well, this is precisely why we want also in the EU to have a fair level playing field. I mean, that's quite clear. Lee, what would you say?
I think on that question about whether there is or has to be a trade-off or not, I think one difficult question has to do with economic priorities, like how we use funding, to be very kind of frank. And I do see a risk of not only the EU, but also member states kind of retreating from global responsibilities, from those kinds of financing responsibilities, and then addressing their own security concerns more than before. And of course, then there is a trade-off if we do those kinds of financial decisions. The other thing I'm a bit worried about, I think you could see it a bit in the Finnish debate around the border law, which I will not go into in itself, but there was this rhetoric around us having to choose between human rights, fundamental rights, and security concerns. And I think that's a dangerous rhetoric for decision makers or countries that wants to uphold and enforce rule of law, democracy, human rights, fundamental rights. I think it's more familiar from autocratic countries and leaders who say that we cannot have both, you have to choose. I think for us, rhetorically, no matter if you are from the right or the left and so on, rhetorically, politically, our aim should always be, and our way of thinking should be, that we combine these when we do policies here, that we always strive for decision-making to which we do not think that you have to choose either or make a trade-off.
Taneli.
With us, I mean, sometimes we face the question, and when it is about whether or not to cooperate or work with the government that we may dislike, or that we may not find sympathetic, and that we think is not upholding the same values and principles that we are. Should we work with them? Should we talk with them or not? Should we simply walk away? And the simple answer is that yes, and if we don't like each other, and then we walk away, and that's, some even call it conditionality. I don't think that actually works, and you need to be ready and also to engage, and perhaps and even especially to engage with the kinds of authorities and governments that you may have an issue with. And I'm not saying that we should become friends with dictators and dictatorships, but if we become too selective and we only cooperate and talk with partners who are exactly of the same view as us, and then our family will get smaller. One observation which makes me a little bit optimistic is actually that over the past year or so, and we've seen quite a few important elections globally in large countries, where we have had, I think many of us have had concerns about the state of democracy, rule of law, perhaps an increasing autocracy. And in many of those countries, actually, people have gone and voted for change. They have actually demonstrated. They've been allowed to vote, their vote has been counted, and they have told that we actually want to have our freedoms, we want to have change. Starting from Poland in the European Union, but I would also say the world's largest democracy, and that sounded a bit, even ironic a few months ago, but India. People went and asked for change. South Africa. And all of a sudden, and those who thought that they are in power eternally, they have to take opposition and people into account. And it's not a revolution, but it is democratic evolution. And I think it's really encouraging, actually, that in this state of the world where we tend to see things very dark, there's actually also light out there.
It's a question of how we also debate things and how they are perceived in the media and politics, of course. Okay, we are not quite at the end yet, but nearing the end of our debate. I'd also like to ask you whether the democratic process that we have in democracies and fundamental rights, is our democratic decision-making too slow in responding to change? We have been talking about change in Turku quite a lot, and we've also come to the conclusion that actually it's the new normal. So the question really is, will our democratic values persist in times of economic and ecological scarcity and also these international security challenges that we have? And perhaps a question to the MEPs especially, but also for Taneli, that will the EU be fit to face those challenges? Who would like to start this time?
Should I start this time?
Yes, go ahead.
I think I have always been of the opinion that being a bit slow is it's a good thing. That's what makes democracies. We are, if you want a really, really efficient procedure for decision making, then you probably should have a dictatorship. They are super efficient in terms of making things happening. So I think, having a public discussion, having multi-stakeholders stating their opinions and so on, these are all features of democracies, and it might make us a bit slow sometimes, or a bit slower than others sometimes, but it's still, we still should hold on to those features in our societies. And we have so many examples also from the European Union of the EU and our democratic states also being able to respond quite rapidly to changes, the pandemic, the war in Ukraine and so on. So I wouldn't be maybe too worried about that. When it comes to the future, I think it's been very nice in this panel that we have all kind of acknowledged the fact that there's so many people around the world fighting for democracy, freedom of speech, for all these fundamental values, that the kind of attraction in these have not gone, the power in these issues have not disappeared anywhere. But if we look at our own countries and why we have such a bleak kind of maybe perception of the future, I think that a lot of members of our own societies have this kind of notion that you don't believe in politics being able to create better societies anymore. This kind of idea of, they used to talk about the societal contract before in Finland, that each generation can trust that, the next generation will have things a bit better than the previous one. So this kind of contract is broken now. I think people do not, like my generation, people younger than me, do not believe that the future will look better for coming generations, because all we hear are the environmental crisis and the labor market is more insecure than before, and there's financial crisis and so on. So I think what politics should focus on more is how we build resilience, that people feel secure in an area of change, and also kind of bring back hope for the future. This kind of feeling of that it is possible also through political decision making to create societies that will be better and more sustainable for the coming generations. I think that's the most pressing issue for our democracies.
Okay. Thank you. That's a note of hope then. We have 4.5 minutes to go. So Mika, Ambassador, and Taneli.
Well, I agree with that delay and taking time is always important. Thucydides once said, a famous historian, that delay is divine. So we should take our time, even in middle of crisis, to plan properly. What is even more important is to gather the will, fix the politics. If there's an enormous task ahead, and there seems to be one, the challenge is clear, globally, regionally, that we have to do something. So let's now gather the will. Clausewitz once said that war or defense is continuation of politics by other means. So proper geostrategic or strategic action in foreign policy requires for us to have a good plan and the will to complete it. If the politics falls apart, and in certain ways it has, in both sides of the Atlantic, then it's very difficult to fight. A good example is US in Vietnam. They basically won all the battles, but they lost the war because the politics underlying it fell apart. So the politics, that's the key, and we have to preserve that and take a moment to build the will to kind of understand the challenge in front of us and have people with us. And when it comes to Ukraine, Finns are there. They agree. Now it's about the politics at the European level, at the NATO level, to support Ukraine and actually make things so that Russia will lose the war. How to do that when it comes to global other challenges? It's important to steal time.
Thank you. Mr. Hiki and Taneli.
Well, I'm pretty optimistic, I have to say. I think your point about the elections is really interesting in Europe, where people thought they were going to go a certain way and they ended up in a different place. And that wasn't because of the politicians necessarily. That was because civil society decided that they didn't want it to go that way. So that gives me a lot of optimism. You know, we're facing our own elections in the United States, as I think some of you probably know, in November, and we have two candidates that could not be more different. I mean, it's really pretty striking. But I have every confidence that the American people are going to make the right choice, and whatever that happens to be. And our democracy will survive, and our democracy, I think, will get stronger. And the reason I believe that is the community of nations that we're getting closer and closer to and talking to, I think, is growing. You know, your point about Europe, I think it's critically important to us. The Indo-Pacific is critically important to us. We can't forget about the Global South at all, and we have no intention. I think your point is exactly right about Western values when we say that. That's sort of an insult to countries in the global south. So we need to find a different vernacular that we're talking to those countries in a respectful and thoughtful way as partners, as opposed to talking down to them. But we can do that, absolutely do that. So I'm wildly optimistic about the future. We just need to take advantage of it.
Thank you. Taneli.
I'm not at all concerned about decision-making of the European democracy. I think we have ample evidence of the past few years where we've taken big, important decisions extremely quickly and good decisions, even despite the very complex and multi-layered democratic system that we uphold. I'm a little bit more concerned about resources, European resources, because policies and politics are more and more European, and we need to be working more globally in order to defend and promote your freedoms, values, and interests. But resources are national. And this differs aside from the US, for example, or China, where we are on the same tables. Our EU budget is about 1/20th of your federal budget or the Chinese budget. And this, I think, requires some thinking going forward, including the European Parliament.
Okay, thank you very much, panelists. Thank you very much for this lively debate, and thank you also to the audience, both here in Turku and online. And with these words of hope, I close the panel, and I hope to see you here next year. Thank you.
Thank you.